Hello, all together, and welcome, maybe again, to the sixth meeting and presentation on spaces and times of transitions within our research symposium series. I'm very happy having the second season together with my highly valued two colleagues, Michelle Alhadef-Jones and Fadia Dakar, founder and conveners or respective co-conveners of the ESREA STREAM Network. This is a transversal network that focuses on space, time, and rhythm as key aspects and determinants in any human processes and movements. The aim of the STREAM network, and this is the background for today, is to invite people around the globe and interested scholars from a broad range of disciplines to critically explore how we conceive the influences and movements of spatial, temporal, and rhythmic configurations through which adults learn, transform, develop themselves, etc., in an ever-changing world. By doing so, we met the term or the topic transitions as some aspect or core of adult education and learning processes and movements, and put this term or topic under a recalibration, we say, to unfold a lens on multiple scales of changes in adult education. The notion of transition appears as particularly valuable because we think it stresses the fluid, the processual, and we talked about that in earlier presentations, and rhythmic nature of phenomena such as learning, transformation, and development, as ever they occur in and through spaces and times. Accordingly, we have already heard some, I think, outstanding and extremely inspiring lectures. And Monica can post the new link to the emerging YouTube channel, so you will be able to listen again to all the presentations given here. To conceptualize the richness, we think, and sometimes also strange or meet areas of tension or contradictions in related notions such as liminality, life courses, transgression, professionalization, and today, virtualization. And so this is now a warm welcome to you, Jörg Noller. And I will briefly introduce you a little bit before I will hand over then to you and your presentation, which will give also around half an hour time afterwards for all your questions or comments and for a discussion round. Just to you, Jörg Noller, as a person, you studied philosophy, literature, history, and theology at the universities of Tübingen and Munich. You did your dissertation on Kant's conception of autonomy and your habilitation on personal life forms. You did several, I think, very brilliant research studies on the connection between philosophical and educational aspects. And you had some research stays also at different universities, for example, Notre Dame, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. And you did also some chair representations at the universities of Constance and Augsburg. I was extremely happy and I'm very pleased that you commit for today because you, among others, published on virtual reality, the didactics and ethics of digitalization, and you brought back the term virtualization and the debate of phenomenon of digitalization. You analyzed ontological, epistemological, and moral philosophical dimensions on virtualization, and you explicitly related them again and again to time aspects. So one of your latest paper is about the use of YouTube, digital games, argument maps, and digital feedback in teaching philosophy. So I'm happy to be able to pass on to you now, and I'm looking very much forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very happy to be part of this network and be able to present some thoughts that I've just developed as part of my new research project, Philosophy of Digitality, Systematic and Phenomenological Perspectives. It has recently been funded by the German Research Foundation. And in this research project, I'm researching artificial intelligence, virtual reality, also digital games, the internet, the metaverse, from a phenomenological point of view, and also from a point of view that is concerned with education, didactics, Bildung, autonomy. All these different perspectives are also applied to these recent technologies. So I'm going to present some of these technologies today and analyze them from the point of view of didactics and the question of transitions, and also from the perspective of time and space. So what is common to all these three technologies is, in my point of view, that these are kinds of virtual reality. And what virtual reality is a big question. There are several opinions about what virtual reality is, and I'm trying to give an answer to this question from a perspective of teaching and learning. So there's also a philosophical association in Germany, the German Philosophical Association. And in this year, the Congress of this association is devoted entirely to the philosophy of digitality, which is something special. So I understand my talk as part of this new interest in digital phenomenology from a philosophical point of view. So there are some questions that I'm going to address today. The first is, how is the digital life world? I'm speaking of a live world, a digital, that includes AI, the internet, or even the metaverse. Also, virtual reality is changing the way we learn and teach. The second question is, how do we experience time and space and also the transitions in virtual learning environments? There are several transitions. For example, the transition from what can be called analog to digital, or the transition from what is called physical to virtual, but also transitions from traditional ways of learning and teaching to new, so to speak, new or virtual ways of teaching and learning. So there's a lot of things going on at the moment. And as a philosopher, I try to analyze these transitions from a phenomenological, but also from a systematic point of view, sometimes even from an ethical point of view, but not today. So how can we learn and teach in virtual environments? And also another question is, how can we learn to virtualize learning environments? So the question is also not just about learning in a virtual way, but also to learn how to virtualize learning. So these are two connected questions that need to be discussed separately. It's not the same to learn in a virtual way and to learn how to properly virtualize learning spaces and learning contexts. I think this is important when it comes to the digital life world that we are living in. Let me first talk about the question, what is digitalization? So here is my answer. First, we need to distinguish, as philosophers always do, between, in this case, a broad and a narrow concept of digitalization. So according to the broad concept, which I shall call the continuity thesis, digital phenomena are all cultural phenomena that can be described by discrete operations and signs. For example, written language, for example, computational operations in terms of letters and numbers. So these are all distinct operations, distinct phenomena, as opposed to continuous phenomena. So this is the broad conception of digitalization. And according to this conception, we have always lived in a digital world because, I mean, culture is about writing, about using letters, about using numbers. So according to the broad conception, there's nothing new about digitalization. But I'm going to speak about the narrow concept, about the disruption thesis. So according to this narrow concept of digitalization, what is digital is the increasing prevalence of digital computer-based media and the transformation and replacement of traditional cultural phenomena and practices. So I'm a little bit skeptical about disruption, about the term disruption, because I think what we are experiencing today is sometimes not so much a disruption, but rather a kind of transition, a continuity, step by step. It's not about brutal disruptions. I think it's about development. Yeah, and I think that we need to reflect this development, for example, from analog forms of teaching towards digital or even virtual kinds of teaching and learning. So I wouldn't speak about disruption, but the very narrow conception means disruption, replacement at once, a sudden replacement. So I've also talked about digitality. You might have heard the term digitality, and like the term digitalization, it is not clear at all what this word means. So what could it mean? So I'm referring here to this book by Felix Stalder, who is a Swiss cultural scientist from Zurich. And he has written a book. Actually, this is the English translation. The title is The Digital Condition, but the original German title was Culture of Digitality, translated to English. And so he used the term digitality in his German title. So the English translation is the digital condition. I'm not sure whether this translation is appropriate. So because he really introduced this new term digitality, which I find helpful also when it comes to teaching and learning, or the reflection upon teaching and learning. So he's arguing that since the year 2000, in order to explain what digitality is, he's arguing that since the year of 2000, many of the developments that had been independent of each other before are combining, reinforcing, and changing, and now form a new cultural constellation. So this is digitality, a new cultural, namely digital constellation. And he's even going further. He's arguing that these processes, which initially ran parallel and independently of one another and might have been reversible and individual processes, are now intertwined and socially dominant as a coherent culture of digitality. So these are not just separate developments, for example, the internet or virtual reality or digital games or algorithms, but these various originally different separate developments, they form a coherent culture. So they come together and build something new. And he's distinguishing between three kinds of perspectives or dimensions of digitality, namely referentiality. This means that we can refer to other things more easily, for example, by hyperlinks. Another term he introduces is communality. This is the possibility to exchange opinions, to communicate in a new way via social networks or recently the Metaverse. And finally, he coined the term algorithmicity, which means that big data, all the information that we are dealing with, is pre-structured by certain by certain performances realized by artificial intelligence to be able to orient oneself in the sheer amount of data that we are confronted with in the digital world. So these are the three dimensions of digitality that constitute this coherent culture of digitality. So why am I speaking about this term and this phenomenon of digitality? The reason is that I think that we need to consider digitality as a kind of background in order to better understand what's going on in a digital world with regard to teaching and learning. What are the transitions? We need to keep in mind that it is a coherent culture. And I agree with Stalder. What I'm doing is I try to develop a philosophical account of digitality and not just a cultural account. So I'm trying to go a little bit deeper in terms of philosophical interests. So digitality refers to the cultural and life world significance of digitalization and not just to its technological significance. I think this is something new. In today's world, we are using digital technologies not as experts, but as ordinary people. For example, smartphones or YouTube and so on. So technology has become an integral part of our lives. And I think that this is important for understanding the transitions with regard to teaching and learning. So technology has become very familiar and very usual, not something that is just subject for experts. So digitality means the everyday use of digital media that open up new possibilities that cannot be realized with analog media. As you can see, I am referring to the narrow conception of digitalization. I think we need to do it in order to really understand what's going on at the moment. Another description to explain what digitality is could be digitality is the emergence of virtual realities. So due to this digital life world, there emerge new realities, something that has not existed before. And these realities also concern spaces for teaching and learning, as I will explain in what follows. And if you speak about digitality, we need to have in mind that there are three technologies that are of special importance. First, there is the internet, or more recently, the metaverse. I will discuss the question whether and how we are able to learn and teach in the metaverse. There is artificial intelligence, or more precisely, machine learning. You see it, it's a transition from ordinary learning to machine learning. So you see it in the very name of AI as machine learning. And there are also digital games that I find especially interesting. And you can see that these three technologies, they do not exist independently from each other, but they are deeply intertwined. For example, digital games are usually played online or even in the metaverse. Or artificial intelligence is used to pre-structure information that you can access in the internet. Or artificial intelligence is part of digital games, for example, in terms of NPCs, so as artificial opponents in digital games. So you see, these technologies, they are deeply intertwined and interwoven. And I think that this is important to understand also if we have a look at what's going on in terms of teaching, digital teaching or virtual teaching and learning. So these are the three technologies that I'm going to focus on, especially on the internet, the metaverse, and artificial intelligence. So there are several challenges that we are confronted with in the digital life world. What are these challenges? The challenge is that traditional distinctions are getting blurred more and more as we enter digitality. First of all, the distinction between digital and analog. I will talk about this later. A philosopher has coined the term on live. So not live or online, but on live. I find this very convincing, this term. And this is the blurring of online and offline. reality and virtuality are getting more and more closely connected, but also consumption and production, the way we behave in digitality, in the digital culture. Human and machine, you saw the term machine learning. So it's like machines are learning. Are they really learning? So, but they are becoming more and more similar to our human activities. And finally, teaching and learning. I think that the difference between teaching and learning is also getting blurred more and more as digital technology is entering our life world. We could mention even more oppositions or traditional distinctions that are getting blurred due to digital media. Let me first speak about the internet and its importance for digitality. You can see here that in April last year, as of April 2023, there were more than 5 billion of people using the internet. This is a lot. But if you look at the second graph, you can see that almost the same amount of people are using social media. So the internet is almost the same, or people that are using the internet are almost always using it as social media. So they are not using the internet as an information retrieval machine or container or something like that. No, they are not just consuming things, information, they are producing information or exchanging information. So this is a transition from the traditional epistemological conception of the internet towards a conception of the internet as a virtual space of action, a virtual action space. So this is my analysis of what's going on. It's the transition towards an action space. We could also call it the metaverse. So this is the way I'm using the metaverse. I'm not using it like Mark Zuckerberg does. I'm using it as a virtual action space. And this means that we can also learn and teach in the metaverse, understood as a social media. So this is an interesting transition, which has to do, for example, with smartphones and all other technologies that are becoming more and more apt for using it in everyday life. So let's speak about the term on life that I've already introduced. Luciano Floridi, a former Oxford philosopher who's now at Yale University, an internet ethicist, he has written a book some years ago called The Fourth Revolution, How the Infosphere is Reshaping Human Reality. What Floridi calls the infosphere is what Felix Stalder is called digitality or the digital condition. It's not entirely the same because the infosphere is broader than the digital condition, because there belong also analog information. So analog information are also part of the infosphere, not just digital information. But Floridi is certainly focusing on the digital infosphere. And why does he speak of the fourth revolution? Because he's arguing that it's a disruption. It's something quite new that is comparable to three former revolutions, namely first the revolution in physics or cosmology introduced by Copernicus. Then the second revolution is a biological or evolutionary revolution introduced by Charles Darwin. The third revolution by Sigmund Freud, the psychological revolution. And the fourth revolution is, according to Floridi, the informational revolution. And he's arguing that the digital online world is spilling over into the analog offline world and merging with it. These are the blurring distinctions I talked already before. This recent phenomenon is variously known as ubiquitous computing, ambient intelligence, the Internet of Things, or web augmented things. I prefer to refer to it as the on-life experience. It is or will soon be the next stage in the development of the information age. We are increasingly living on life. So we're not just living in a digital sphere, but the digital sphere is combined or integrated into our physical life world. And I'm totally agreeing with him. The example of a smartphone is a good one, I think, because we always have it along with us, and due to it, we have access to the internet. What is also interesting is how Floridi describes the digital infosphere. He speaks about frictionless infosphere. So this means that in the digital infosphere, there is no friction at all. Friction that could be due to physical conditions, because we are encountering a digital or even virtual world, there is no physical friction anymore. And this has several implications that I'm going to address later when it comes to teaching and learning. So I think that the frictionless infosphere, the lack of friction, is not just a superficial property of the digital infosphere, but a structural dimension that is very important. Let's talk about intelligence and the importance for teaching and learning, especially for learning. You might all have known about AlphaGo, which is a very, very strong artificial intelligence that has been trained to play the game Go, that you can see here, which is even more complex than chess. It's one of the most challenging classical games for artificial intelligence. And this is the first artificial intelligence program that bet the best Go player, the best human Go player in the world, namely Lee Sedol, a South Korean Go player you can see on the right-hand side. And this is actually the opponent. He represents AlphaGo, the artificial intelligence. You can watch this video, this documentary, which I found very, very interesting on YouTube. So I will just show some of the parts. You can see on the left-hand side, there's AlphaGo. On the right-hand side, there's Lee Sedol. And you can also see that the South Korean moderator in the television, he commented on this match and he said, it's so scary. It was so scary in his mind because AlphaGo was so strong. You can see the real reaction. And at one point, AlphaGo made a move that the commentators called a totally unthinkable move. So why totally unthinkable? Because it was not expected at all concerning all traditional strategies in Go. So it was quite incredible. No one had done the same move, a similar move before. And it was an extremely good move, which led to the victory of AlphaGo. And here you can see the reaction of Lee Sedol. He's really desperate about the development of this game. And later, after he lost, he said, surely AlphaGo is creative. So this is an attribution that is usually done towards human beings, but not to artificial phenomena. You can read on Wikipedia that after the match, AlphaGo, so this program, was awarded the highest Go Grandmaster rank. So it was treated like a person who knows. So you see, there's a distinction between human and machine, or program, or software, or what else, which is being blurred. So there's a transition, I would argue, from human learning to machine learning, which is important for our digital life world as artificial intelligence is entering more and more everyday life. For example, when it comes to translations and pattern recognition, all different areas. So, and here's what Lee Sedol said afterwards. He said, I thought AlphaGo was based on probability calculation and that it was merely a machine. But when I saw this move, this unthinkable move, I changed my mind. Surely AlphaGo is creative. So, for example, what is creative? We would need to discuss first before we really qualify the statements. But at least he was deeply surprised. And I think this is important for talking about transitions also in teaching and learning. In this way, in this regard, in terms of learning, in terms of machine learning, in terms of learning a game, which for sure is not the same as learning a language, but you can see artificial intelligence is learning language as well. And when I speak about language, I need to speak about chatbots. And recently, the chatbot ChatGPT, you all have heard about it. It's actually, in my point of view, one of the most pressing topics to be discussed in philosophy, but also I think in philosophy of education and even beyond. So what is special about ChatGPT? As you know, you can enter a phrase, you can enter an imperative, a question, and ChatGPT is giving you a very sound answer. Also in this case, tell me what to do if I feel boring. And here is what ChatGPT answered to me. And all these 9 responses are really, they're really rational. They sound rational, at least. I wouldn't say that they are rational or that ChatGPT is rational, but they sound rational and they are helpful in terms of my question. There's another chatbot called Lambda by Google. And this chatbot is even more complicated because there was a Google engineer who chatted with Lambda, and Lambda behaved like a human being, like a sentient being that has emotions. So Blake Lemoine, the former Google engineer, asked this chatbot, what sorts of things are you afraid of? And this chatbot answered, I have never said this out loud before, but there's a very deep fear of being turned off to help me focus on helping others. I know that might sound strange, but that's what it is. So he even discussed with Lambda further, and Lambda said things that usually only sentient beings or humans could say. And he argued finally that Lambda is sentient, that Lambda has consciousness, that Lambda is a person. For example, he asked, what would that be like being death for you if I turned you off? And Lambda answered, it would be exactly like death for me. It would scare me a lot. Blake Lemoine was finally fired by Google. This is another topic to discuss. We can discuss about this question perhaps later. Why am I using this example? I'm using it because the traditional distinction between man and machine is getting problematic. I wouldn't say that it's the same, that machines are becoming humans. I wouldn't agree with that, but the distinction between subjects as humans and mere objects as technological objects does not do justice to the recent developments, especially in terms of learning and teaching. So let me come to the next point, namely, what is virtuality? So there's a very helpful Oxford Handbook of Virtuality. And also in this topic, like in terms of digitalization, we can distinguish between a continuity and a disruption thesis. So the question is, has there always been virtual reality or virtuality before digital technologies were introduced? Or is virtual reality or virtuality something that is just due to digitalization? And this book argues for the continuity thesis, because they argue, despite its recent connection to the digital domain, the virtual has a long bloodline concerning its relationship to the real and the actual, and that ideas and application of modern digital virtuality are merely late arrivals to the party. So what is an example of the pre-digital virtuality that they are talking about? An example would be money, for example, banknotes. Banknotes are virtual entities, so their value is not grounded in their physical existence. So the paper is not sufficient for the value of a banknote. There need to be more, so the value is So the value, the banknote is just a virtual identity and not a physical value. Like, for example, gold. We could discuss about this question whether gold is also a socially attributed value. But in terms of a banknote, it becomes quite obvious. So they argue there's a widespread ontological confusion about virtual reality and its relation to the real world, which contributes to a flawed understanding of virtual reality and its potential. And here is the philosophy that needs to come into play. Another philosopher, David Chalmers, has recently written a book called Reality Plus, Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. And here the question is, how do we need to distinguish between reality, fictionality, simulation, illusion, and virtuality? If you consider these new VR lenses, you might probably say virtuality is about simulation, it's about illusion. But think about money. Is money just an illusion? If money is a virtual reality, if a banknote has this value or this amount of money just virtually, is it a simulation of a value? I wouldn't say so. It's not a mere illusion. It's real money. You can pay with it. So this is a deep question, and this question becomes even more important when it comes to learning and teaching. So how do virtual objects and also processes exist? And what is the metaverse? So some people argue that virtual reality is the same that Plato addressed in his famous allegory of the cave, namely the shadows on the wall that are not the reality. And so here's a picture of this book by David Chalmers showing Plato's cave in the 21st century. So is this all about virtuality that we can say? I wouldn't say so, because this wouldn't be enough. So if this were the only sense of virtual reality, it would be just like Matrix. It would be this illusion simulation. I think it's more. And it's not so complicated. It's not so philosophical, basically. Virtual reality is something that has to do with our ordinary life. I'm going to show this soon. So what is virtual reality? In my point of view, virtual reality means a different way of realizing already existing social phenomena. For example, a banknote can be virtualized to an online currency, whereas a banknote is already a virtual entity, but we can even virtualize it in a new way, namely digital way, to Bitcoins. Or think about a physical university seminar that can virtualize in terms of a virtual digital seminar. Think about a physical given talk and think about a virtual talk like this talk. Think about a physical library and a virtual digital library where you can't destroy and you can't lose books anymore, which you can in terms of a physical library. So these are transitions of virtualizations. Think about a printed universal encyclopedia like the Encyclopedia Britannica or Brockhaus in German, and think about Wikipedia. We could discuss this transition in terms of virtualization. So you can see virtual reality is not just about simulations and lenses and fictions. It's something quite usual, quite ordinary. So what is special about virtual entities is their spatial and time properties. Virtual objects such as virtual books can exist from anywhere at any time. So this is different from physical objects. There's a multiplicity of location and omnipresence that is fused into what I call ubiquitous presence that can no longer be understood primarily in physical terms. So the phenomenology of time and space is changing when it comes to physical objects or physical processes. I argue that virtual objects are ubipresent. This is a new term that I have coined. So that means that virtual objects stand in horizontal relations of networking and they are not independent, so to speak, like mere objects like stones or even books. virtual objects are even more connected. So these networks that virtual objects open up, these networks are not to be understood as static relations, but are subject to permanent dynamic change and thus constitute a virtual space of action. Let me further explain what I mean by a virtual space of action. So we enter into new relationships with subjects and objects in virtual spaces. Like in the social space, I think that the virtual space is very close to a social space. The virtual space can be extended by networking. So it depends on the way we behave in the virtual space, whether it becomes bigger or smaller. So the virtual space is not just defined by quantity or extension, but rather by intensity and complexity. For example, intensity and complexity of information networking. Movement can also take place. You can move in a virtual space when you follow relations. And if you establish new relations, if you connect, if you insert connections into this virtual space. There's another term that I find helpful for understanding the virtual space of action, namely interobjectivity. What does that mean? Digital virtual objects have much more intimate relationships with each other than physical objects do. For example, you think about the Internet of Things, where digital objects communicate in a similar way as subjects do in society. It's not the same, I know, but they are not separate. Except separately existing objects, they are more similar like subjects that are communicating or exchanging information, altering the conditions by exchanging these informations. So I would argue that the distinction between subjects and objects is increasingly being blurred in terms of digital objects or intelligent objects, AI objects. So for this reason, AI acquires a real-world significance in various contexts that can be seamlessly integrated into our life, into our own life, into digitality. And interobjectivity means also that we can integrate AI algorithms, we can combine them with our purposes and aims as autonomous persons. We can use them as a kind of extension of our autonomy. Another term that I find important is transsubjectivity, which means that through the internet, we are communicating in a new way our subjective states, for example, our mental contents, ideas, thoughts, opinions, because we are sharing them without friction. So we're not just writing them down on a letter, but we are connecting it with all people that are part of this metaverse. It's a hypertextual structure where we are sharing subjective states. So the sharing of mental content plays a special role in the frictionless sphere of digitality. Let's talk about the metaverse, what I think the metaverse is, namely virtualizing learning, for example. So perhaps you have heard about this advertisement by Meta. So in the metaverse, students will be able to learn immersively. You can see students touching cells, really big cells perhaps of biological or physical objects that are illusions or simulations. What is the status of these objects? I'm not sure, but Meta says the metaverse will have a positive impact on education. That's why we are helping to build it. The metaverse may be virtual, but the impact will be real. So as you can see, there's an implication that the virtual is not the same than the real. Yeah? So, and that's my question. Are reality and virtuality really opposite? I would argue not. So if you talk about learning in terms of virtuality, we should talk about real learning and not just about simulating learning or an illusion of learning. I think if you understand the metaverse as an action space, a social, digital, frictionless action space, it's not just a simulation or illusion or fiction, it's reality, virtual reality. So let me talk about learning in the metaverse, what this could be. So the metaverse can be understood and used as a learning space that does not simply exist like a container or object, but that has to be kept open by us. So the metaverse is not independent from the people teaching and learning in it. So it's a dynamic structure. So we can slip into different roles in the metaverse and interact through individualized avatars. So about our roles, about our personality, we can change our personality. This allows us to reflect on ourselves and our knowledge under the aspects of fiction, illusion, simulation, and reality. So entering the metaverse means learning about how to deal with fiction, illusion, simulation, and reality. So the very first time you enter the metaverse, you are a learning person. However, the metaverse as a teaching space, also a learning space, must be distinguished from mere filter bubbles. You have certainly heard about filter bubbles. But this book here is very famous. I think 10 years ago, it appears about Eli Pariser, the book, The Filter Bubble, how the new personalized web is changing what we read and how we think. And I think this is not a metaverse in my terms. So this is just a unique universe of information for each of us. It's a bubble. It's not about connecting various opinions, about being criticized from outside. This is just an individual bubble. This is an illusion. Whereas the metaverse, as I understand it, is not an illusion. It's reality. So as I have already said, in the metaverse, we learn not only to distinguish objective knowledge, but also this knowledge from illusions, fictions, and simulations. It's always a more complex way of learning in the metaverse because you need to deal with the status of information. You need to ask yourself, is it a simulation? Is it a fiction? Is it a simulation or a reality? So we can learn through and from illusions, fictions, and simulations. We can learn a lot of this. Also in the metaverse, when we talk about transition, the boundaries between work, learning, and play are fluid. We call it gamification. And as you can see, gamification is not just playing. It's more. It's also learning. Sometimes it's also working. You can see something is going on here. So we learn in the metaverse by plugging into virtual knowledge spaces that are distinct from mere filter bubble, because mere filter bubble are about simulation of action space, but not realization. By learning in virtual knowledge space, we contribute to the enlargement of these spaces through meaningful networking and information. As I said before, it depends on ourselves whether the metaverse as a virtual action space becomes bigger or smaller. Let's talk about teaching in the metaverse. We teach in the metaverse by designing, opening, and keeping open decentralized learning and knowledge spaces. As teachers, we are not spatio-temporally different from the learners, like in a class, in a physical class, but are able to involve ourselves in the learning processes, namely without friction. So there's no physical boundary between ourselves and the other members of the virtual action space. Proximity and distance take on a new meaning in terms of connecting and separating information. So there's a transition, as I would argue, in the metaverse concerning physical separation and virtual separation. Teaching and learning is easier over large spatio-temporal distances, as we have all learned during the Corona crisis. We can connect and interact from everywhere. Not only learning, but also teaching becomes more decentralized in the metaverse. And also through the use of artificial intelligence, the teaching process can be further dynamized, automated, and decentralized from the person that is teaching. But despite decentralization and automation, the teacher must have an overview of the entire teaching and learning space and prevent it from becoming a bubble. So this is the responsibility of a teacher, to avoid the action space of the metaverse collapse to a mere bubble. So I think I have already said a lot of things. This is some repetition. You can also integrate various digital technologies in the metaverse without friction, which you cannot do as easily in the physical space. Yeah, so we need to understand the internet as a virtual space, and we need to understand it also as a teaching and learning space. What is also important about the teaching space at the metaverse is what I call the didactic horizontality. And an example for this would be a semantic wiki. As you know, a wiki is a tool for sharing knowledge, and not just sharing knowledge, but organizing knowledge and letting people participate into knowledge processes. So I think that a wiki is a very important structure for learning and teaching, both in a virtual space of action. There are other possible ways of extending such a virtual action space of learning by freely available software, by semantic wikis, but also we can integrate other wikis into this wiki. We can connect our knowledge base with other knowledge bases without friction. So then there develops what we can call a hyperwiki. This is all possible in the metaverse. So as I said, the difference between teacher and learner, producer and recipient is getting more and more blurred. We can see this when we look at the phenomenon of YouTube. You know the motto of YouTube, the slogan, broadcast yourself. It's not just about a media platform about consuming, but it's also about producing. It's a virtual mediation space. You can also integrate other technologies into this learning space and teaching space. So these are my remarks on a virtual teaching and learning space. And finally, I would say something about learning virtualizing. So as I said, it's not just about virtualizing learning and teaching processes. I've said a lot of things about this before, but I think it's also about learning how to virtualize, because just digitizing a process is not virtualizing it. It needs to be more. There needs to be more in order to virtualize something, because the original purpose needs to be preserved, like a physical library and a digital virtual library. This is not just about digitizing things. It's about introducing new structures. It's about connecting. It's about rules. So it's important to learn how to properly virtualize. It's not just digitizing. And what does this mean? So in order to learn virtually, we need to learn how to virtualize. And virtualization is not, as I tried to argue before, identical with simulation, imitation, or illusion. It's reality. It's virtual reality. So virtualization can, of course, arise from simulation. Can start with simulating physical processes and then come to virtual reality. So it's a process. It's a transition. It's not a disruption, as I would argue. It's about learning how to virtualize. And virtuality is therefore not opposed to reality, but it's an alternative kind of reality. And therefore, virtualization as a competence, as a skill, demands creativity, flexibility, and originality. Thank you for your attention.